Hey guys, tonight we sink back into a world where water isn't something you keep running endlessly in the background while you brush your teeth. Instead, every bucket you carry has weight, every bath is a minor event, and, if you're unlucky, you'll be climbing into water that already held 3 other people. Welcome to the strange world of medieval bathing rules. You'll hear why towns sometimes banned private baths, how whole families squeezed into one steamy tub, and why the people of the Middle Ages may not have been quite as filthy as popular myths suggest. One thing's certain, you probably wouldn't survive the smell. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you drop your location and your current time down in the comments. Let's see who's listening from a candlelit midnight bedroom and who's sneaking this in at lunchtime. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a muddy lane lined with crooked houses, each jutting forward at strange angles as if competing for space in the narrow street. You're carrying a small bucket of water, but it sloshes dangerously close to spilling. Clean water is precious. You fetched it from the town's well earlier, waiting your turn among gossiping neighbors. Already you know it won't last long. One bucket for drinking, another for cooking, maybe a splash for rinsing a bowl, and if you're lucky, one for washing yourself. The rules around when and how you wash might feel bizarre by modern standards, but in a world without plumbing, every drop had to be managed. Bathing, surprisingly, was not completely alien to medieval people. Public bathhouses thrived in many towns, especially across continental Europe. They weren't the luxurious Roman baths with mosaic floors and marble columns, but they served the same function, somewhere to get clean, socialize, and depending on the place, perhaps enjoy less innocent services. The authorities often struggled to regulate these spaces. Bans on bathhouses would come and go like the tides, usually in response to disease outbreaks or rising fears of immorality. Historians still argue whether those bans reflected genuine concern for hygiene or whether they were more about stamping down on sinful behavior. Imagine stepping into one of these public baths. The water is cloudy, lukewarm, and smells faintly of herbs, or maybe of nothing at all if times are tight. You lower yourself onto a wooden bench inside a great steaming vat. Around you, merchants discuss trade routes, apprentices whisper about girls, and someone's grandmother complains about her aching knees. The baths doubled as community hubs, which made them both useful and suspicious. Useful, because people genuinely did wash. Suspicious, because any place where men and women mingled in thin linen shifts was bound to make church authorities twitchy. But when the Black Death tore through Europe in the 14th century, the whole question of bathing changed. One prevailing belief was that hot water opened the pores and allowed disease to seep in more easily. So, bizarre as it sounds, washing too thoroughly was thought to invite sickness. Towns issued rules forbidding private tubs or discouraging visits to public ones. Instead, people wiped themselves down with linen cloths, perfumed with rose water or vinegar. It's one of those moments where you're tempted to shout across history, "No, that's the opposite of what you should do." But to them, it seemed perfectly logical. At home, water meant work. Heating it required chopping wood, tending a fire, and waiting ages for a cauldron to boil. Families often shared the same bathwater to save on effort and fuel. First the father, then the mother, then the children in order of age. By the time the baby was lowered in, the water was more soup than bath. You can picture the smell. Wood smoke from the fire mingling with sweat, damp wool clothing hung nearby, and the faint tang of iron from the cauldron. Still, those brief soaks mattered. They were little islands of comfort in an otherwise rough daily life. Now, not everyone approved of this habit. Rules in some towns limited how often bathhouses could open, sometimes restricting them to 1 or 2 days a week. In certain places, fines were given if you were caught hosting unlicensed bath gatherings at home. The logic was simple. Large groups gathering in small, steamy rooms was a recipe for trouble, whether moral or medical. Yet, human nature being what it is, many people ignored the bans and kept sneaking in for a soak. One quirky tidbit: some bathhouses doubled as restaurants. Imagine sitting in a tub with a towel wrapped around you while an attendant brings a plate of roasted meat or a flagon of beer. Accounts from the time describe people eating and drinking right there in the water. It's a scene both cozy and unsettling. You're nibbling a chicken leg while the guy next to you dunks his armpits in the bath. Of course, historians still argue whether the Middle Ages were really as dirty as the stereotype suggests. Archaeological finds of combs, tweezers, and soapstones suggest personal grooming was more common than we think. People cared about appearances, especially when social reputation mattered so much. Perfumed gloves, scented oils, even early deodorant powders were part of the medieval toolkit. Cleanliness wasn't just about health. It was about status, piety, and sometimes sheer survival in crowded towns. And yet, rules kept cropping up to remind people that water was dangerous, scarce, or sinful if enjoyed too much. You can imagine the absurdity. One year the town crier bellows that bathhouses are banned because of plague. The next year they're reopened because everyone smells unbearable. It's a cycle of fear, relief, and compromise, repeated across centuries. As you shuffle through this world in your mind, you notice how every choice about water ties back to survival. Too much indulgence in baths, and you risk scandal or infection. Too little, and you become the walking embodiment of stink. Either way, you can't win. And yet, oddly enough, those rules, those bans, those awkward shared tubs, helped medieval society balance scarce resources and survive in conditions that would send most modern folks fleeing for the nearest shower. You shuffle out of the bathhouse in your imagination, shivering a little as the cool night air hits your damp skin. The muddy street waits outside, the same one that has been churned up by cartwheels, hooves, and the occasional careless dumping of chamber pot contents. You try not to think too hard about where the mud ends and something less polite begins. Your feet squelch as you walk, and suddenly you understand why medieval people had so many rules about shoes and where they could and couldn't be worn. Inside a home, those shoes were not just frowned upon. They could be downright forbidden. Imagine stomping into your neighbor's timber-framed cottage with muddy boots still on. It wouldn't just be considered rude. In some towns, it could get you fined. Dirt wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an active threat to health. With straw floors that absorbed every spill, crumb, and scrap, adding muddy prints was like layering a cake of bacteria right under your bed. So the rule was simple: shoes off, or at least wipe before entering. The logic was less about etiquette in the modern sense and more about survival. Those heavy leather boots you wore outside weren't just caked in mud. They tracked in animal dung, spoiled food, and the microscopic troublemakers that came with them. And in an age when people didn't know about bacteria but definitely knew about illness, superstition and common sense worked together to create customs. Some households even had a dedicated bench by the door for removing shoes. Picture it. You step into the shadowy interior, light filtering through cracks in the shutters, and you sit down on a rough-hewn bench. Off come the boots, stiff with mud, maybe stuffed with straw for warmth. You pad further inside in soft socks or barefoot, feeling the packed earth floor beneath you. Suddenly the whole house feels calmer, cleaner, more private, a separation between the chaotic outside world and the fragile sanctuary within. Now here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, people didn't just take off their shoes, they swapped them. Visitors might be offered indoor slippers, often made of fabric or softer leather. These weren't luxury house shoes like we imagine today, but practical things, easier to clean, less damaging to floors, and frankly nicer to walk in. It's a detail that reminds you the medieval world wasn't one endless slog of filth. They had little niceties tucked away. The penalties for breaking the custom could be surprisingly stiff. Records from certain guild halls show fines for apprentices who failed to clean their boots before stepping in. Imagine the scene. A muddy-footed teenager tries to sneak into a carpenter's workshop, and the master, furious about sawdust clumping into muck, hauls him before the guild elders. The punishment? A fine, maybe a whipping, and certainly a lecture long enough to make him regret every step. Historians still argue whether these rules were primarily hygienic or symbolic. On one hand, yes, keeping filth out of homes was obviously practical. On the other, taking off shoes symbolized respect. The act itself was a gesture of humility, of leaving the outside world behind and acknowledging the household's sanctity. In this way, it mirrored customs in other cultures, like removing shoes in temples or mosques. Was medieval Europe consciously thinking the same way? Hard to say. But when you picture the ritual pausing at the threshold, bending down, slipping off those heavy boots, it does feel more than practical. It feels almost spiritual. Of course, the rules weren't applied evenly. The wealthy had more reason to insist on cleanliness indoors since they had more expensive floors, rugs, and tapestries to protect. Imagine a noble household with imported carpets from the East. Tracking in muck wasn't just gross, it was an insult to wealth itself. In contrast, peasants with packed dirt floors still followed the custom, but partly out of comfort. Who wants to sleep in a room where the floor has turned into a swamp? There's a darker layer, too. Some towns had ordinances specifically targeting workers who came straight from dirty trades. A butcher, for example, might be forbidden to step inside certain public spaces without changing his boots. The leather would be soaked with blood and grease, and in a crowded church or tavern, the stench was unbearable. So the rule wasn't just shoes off. It was don't bring the slaughterhouse into God's house. Again, practical and symbolic at once. And then there's the funny side of it. Picture a medieval feast, long wooden tables groaning under roasted meats, candles flickering, everyone leaning in with greasy fingers. Then some poor soul walks in, shoes still dripping mud, and suddenly the room fills with mutters. You just know the host is seething, thinking, great, now I'll have to scatter extra rushes tomorrow. Because that's another thing. People often covered their floors with straw or rushes. Freshly laid rushes meant a fresher smelling home, but also a clean start. Tracking mud onto them too soon was basically undoing all the housework in one sloppy step. One curious custom involved wiping your shoes not just outside, but on the rushes themselves. Guests sometimes shuffled along deliberately, scouring their soles on the greenery like a living doormat. It was half cleaning, half deodorizing. Imagine the sound, the faint crunch of straw underfoot, the smell of herbs woven into the rushes, lavender, thyme, maybe mint. A medieval air freshener hidden underfoot. Of course, there's scholarly debate about how strictly these customs were enforced. Some historians argue the fines and rules were rare exceptions, not daily realities. After all, people walked in and out constantly. Enforcing shoes off for everyone might have been impossible. Others suggest that the rules were about specific times, like feast days or holy gatherings, when cleanliness and respect mattered more. Either way, the very existence of such customs shows that medieval life was not the careless mud bath we often imagine. You can almost laugh thinking about the modern parallels. Today we argue over shoes off at the door like it's a matter of personality. Back then, it was survival strategy. You didn't need a passive-aggressive welcome mat. You had town ordinances threatening fines. Maybe there's something reassuring in knowing humans have been bickering about footwear for centuries. So as you step carefully across that straw-strewn floor in your mind, bare feet sinking into soft rushes, you feel the boundary. Outside, mud, danger, chaos. Inside, order, warmth, the smell of cooking stew. All thanks to a simple, slightly weird rule about where your boots belong. And strangely enough, it worked. That separation kept homes healthier, guild halls cleaner, and communities just a little bit more livable in a world where one careless boot print could mean sickness spreading under the floor. You finish brushing the last bits of straw from your feet and step back into the narrow medieval street, only to realize you're walking through something far less pleasant than mud. Overhead, a window creaks open. You instinctively flatten yourself against the wall because you've learned the hard way what might come flying out of those upper stories. And sure enough, with the grace of routine, someone tips a chamber pot right into the lane below. A slosh, a splash, and suddenly you're grateful you pressed your back to the wall instead of strolling down the middle. Welcome to the strange etiquette of medieval waste disposal. One of those details people love to joke about when they picture the Middle Ages, but like most odd customs, it made sense in its own way. Indoor plumbing simply didn't exist for the vast majority of people. Every household had a chamber pot, sometimes porcelain, sometimes just a wooden or metal bucket tucked under a bed or bench. You use it during the night, especially when streets were unsafe or freezing. And in the morning, the pot had to be emptied somewhere. The rule, right out the window. Now it wasn't as careless as you might think. There was a whole etiquette around it. In many towns, you were expected to shout a warning before dumping. The phrase varied by region, garde à l'eau, in French, or look out below, in English. You imagine the half-hearted cry from a tired housewife leaning out with her bucket at dawn. Was it always enough warning? Probably not. The clatter of carts, the chatter of passers-by, the general din of animals meant plenty of people still got a very unpleasant surprise. The smell, as you can guess, was overwhelming. Streets were narrow, often with houses leaning toward each other until they nearly touched at the top. That meant waste didn't just vanish into open air. It lingered, caught between walls, soaking into straw and mud. Yet bizarrely, towns had rules that allowed this practice while simultaneously scolding people for doing it carelessly. You might get fined for dumping waste at the wrong time of day, or for failing to shout the warning, but not for the act itself. And here's the quirky twist. Some places designated specific hours when waste could be tossed. Imagine a bell ringing at dawn or dusk, signaling not just curfew but bucket time. Everyone knew to stay clear of certain lanes during those windows. The streets became briefly hazardous zones, like dodging water balloons, but far, far less fun. Historians still argue whether these scheduled disposal times were widely followed or more wishful thinking from town councils. After all, when nature calls, few people are willing to wait for a bell. For wealthier homes, the rules were a little different. Castles and large houses often had guardrobes, essentially a built-in toilet with a chute leading down to the moat or a cesspit. You might think that was an upgrade, but it had its own issues. The chute often emptied directly into waterways, meaning the same moat you were supposed to defend the castle with was also, well, your sewer. There are accounts of armies besieging castles who deliberately poisoned or blocked these waste chutes to spread disease. Suddenly, the chamber pot window dump seems almost preferable. One delightful tidbit: archaeologists sometimes find fragments of broken pottery in medieval cesspits. Why? Because chamber pots cracked and broke when people tried to empty them out the window. You can picture the frustration. Lean too far, lose your grip, and there goes your pot along with the contents. Down below, some unlucky neighbor gets both a splash and a shattered jug. It wasn't just households contributing to the mess. Inns and taverns had their own pots, and with dozens of guests packed into shared rooms, the output was prodigious. Rules often required innkeepers to clean the street in front of their property, but enforcement varied. One day you might find a clean path, the next you'd be wading ankle-deep in filth. And the animals didn't help. Pigs, dogs, horses, all adding their share to the stew. The church tried occasionally to step in. Preachers railed against filth as a sign of moral decay. Civic leaders passed ordinances about cleaning streets on certain days. Yet the practice persisted for centuries. Why? Because it was practical. Cesspits filled quickly, hauling waste outside the city cost money, and for the average family, the easiest solution was the window. Historians still argue about just how bad it really was. Some claim the streets were rivers of sewage, ankle-deep, impossible to avoid. Others suggest this is exaggeration, pointing to records of organized street cleaning, or evidence that many towns had surprisingly efficient systems for waste removal. The truth is probably in between. Some neighborhoods were relatively tidy, others absolute nightmares. Much depended on the wealth of the town and the diligence of its officials. And then there's the humor. Medieval jokes often reference the chamber pot mishaps, just as we laugh at slapstick accidents today. Imagine the medieval version of a comedy skit, a pompous merchant striding down the street, only to be doused by a careless maid. The audience would roar because everyone knew it could happen any day. Humor, after all, thrives on shared experiences, and nothing was more shared than the daily need to dump the pot. There was also an element of danger. Falling waste wasn't just disgusting, it could spread disease. People knew this even if they didn't understand germs. Rules emerged about where you could empty your pot. Some towns banned dumping on major thoroughfares, directing people instead to back alleys or designated pits. Yet, human laziness being eternal, plenty ignored the law. After all, why carry your sloshing pot down 3 flights of stairs when the window was right there? And then comes the irony. In many cases, the very same waste was eventually reused. Farmers collected night soil from town and spread it on fields as fertilizer. So what started as a disgusting hazard became, indirectly, food on your table. You can't help but laugh at the circularity of it. What you dumped on the street today might be in your bread tomorrow. Grim, yes, but oddly efficient. Picture yourself walking down such a lane now. The houses lean overhead, the air heavy with cooking smoke, animal musk, and a tang of something less pleasant. You step carefully, testing each patch of ground before committing your foot. The people around you do the same, their eyes flicking upward at every creak of a window. It's a dance of survival, half vigilance, half resignation. The rules about chamber pots may seem bizarre now, but in a world without sewage systems, they kept life moving. Crude, smelly, but practical. And maybe, just maybe, you start to appreciate the luxury of a flushing toilet in your own time. The street grows darker as the day slips away, shadows stretching long between crooked houses. You pause, listening. Then it comes the low, solemn toll of the town bell, one note then another rolling out across the rooftops. Everyone around you reacts as if on cue. Merchants shutter their stalls, apprentices scurry to finish errands. Even the drunk outside the tavern straightens for a moment, blinking blearily as though reminded he's late. It isn't just a sound, it's a command. Curfew. In the medieval town, the bell was more than background noise. It was authority echoing across stone and timber, telling you exactly when the day ended and the night began. You might think it was about keeping order or perhaps religious observance, and it was partly. But beneath it all, it was survival. Fire, crime, and chaos waited in the dark. The curfew bell was society's way of drawing a line in the sand. Inside now or else. Imagine standing in the square as the great iron bell sways. Its vibrations thrum through your ribs, a physical reminder that the town is alive, beating its mechanical heart above you. For you, the bell means hurry home. For the watchman, it means his long night is about to start. For the authorities, it's a promise that the town will quiet itself before trouble sparks. And for anyone out past the bell's command, it's a warning. They're already suspicious. The word curfew itself comes from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. That's the first odd rule the bell demanded, not just to go home, but to literally cover or extinguish household fires. Chimneys were small, houses pressed tightly together, and a single stray ember could mean disaster. Towns weren't built with fire safety codes. They were tinderboxes of thatch, timber, and tar. So when the bell tolled, you grabbed a metal lid or a pot of ash and smothered your hearth. The room went dark, smoky, and a little colder, but safer. Of course, this didn't always sit well. Who wants to douse their one source of warmth just because the authorities say so? Some families bent the rule, covering the fire lightly so they could stir it back to life later. Others tried to hide small flames in enclosed hearths. And inevitably, some ignored the rule entirely. Historians still argue whether the cover your fire order was followed by everyone or just paid lip service, like modern fire drills where half the class wanders slowly outside. But even the act of commanding it reinforced the message. The night is dangerous, keep it contained. Crime was the second reason for curfews. Darkness hid too many opportunities. Thieves could slip into houses, cut purses, or vanish into alleys. After the bell, only the watchmen and those with special permission were supposed to be on the streets. If you were caught wandering without good reason, you risked fines or worse. Town charters sometimes laid this out explicitly. No one outside after the 9th bell unless on urgent business. Imagine being stopped by a burly watchman with a lantern, his dog sniffing suspiciously at your bag. How do you prove you aren't up to no good? Quirky tidbit: some towns actually issued night licenses for approved activities. A baker, needing to tend his ovens, might carry a token proving he was allowed out. Doctors on house calls could do the same. It's an early version of the ID badge, centuries before plastic laminates. And of course, some enterprising crooks forged or stole them, proving that bureaucracy and fraud go hand in hand no matter the century. But the bell wasn't just a warning, it was also a comfort. People timed their lives around it. Travelers arriving late would hear the bell and know they had to find shelter quickly. Children learned to fear being outside after curfew, their parents' warnings echoing with the toll. And in villages without bells, horns, or drums took their place. Imagine the haunting sound of a horn across the valley at dusk, telling everyone the same thing: shut your doors, cover your fire, and pray the night passes quietly. Of course, not everyone complied. Taverns often became lively just as the bell rang. Alehouses stretched their business deep into the night, shutters drawn, laughter muffled but unmistakable. Authorities frowned on it, but shutting down drinking entirely was impossible. So instead, rules adapted. Some towns allowed taverns to stay open if they paid extra taxes, essentially buying their way out of curfew. It's a loophole that feels all too familiar. There's debate among historians about how heavily curfews were enforced. Were the streets really deserted after the bell? Or did people quietly carry on, slipping through alleys and ignoring the rules unless caught? Records of fines and punishments suggest some level of enforcement, but diaries and tailies hint at nocturnal life that thrived regardless. Perhaps the truth is that curfew shaped behavior broadly, even if it wasn't absolute. You didn't need every person to comply, just enough to tilt the balance toward order. The bell also linked deeply to religion. Monasteries structured their entire day around bells, matins, lauds, vespers, each hour marked by sound. Towns echoed this rhythm, even if less formally. Curfew was often tied to evening prayers, blending civic safety with spiritual duty. Covering your fire wasn't just practical, it was framed as obedience to God's order. You can almost hear a preacher booming from the pulpit: as you smother the flame in your hearth, so too smother the flames of sin. And then there's the humor in imagining all this. Picture a medieval teenager sneaking out after curfew, slipping barefoot through alleys to meet friends by the river. The watchman catches him, hauls him back home, and his furious parents have to pay the fine. Some things never change. Curfews have always been made to be broken. The difference is that in medieval times, the risk wasn't just grounded. It could mean being branded a thief or hauled to the pillory for public shame. Speaking of which, some towns paired curfew with literal bells carried by watchmen as they patrolled. These night watch figures would walk the streets, swinging lanterns, calling the hour and reminding everyone of the rules. Imagine trying to sneak home quietly while some cheerful watchman belts out, 10 o'clock and all's well. Not exactly stealth-friendly. But for the law-abiding, that call was reassuring. Someone was awake, keeping an eye out. There's a darker layer, too. In times of unrest, curfew became a tool of control. Rebellious towns, conquered cities, or even certain groups within a community could be subjected to harsher night restrictions. Curfew bells became symbols of power. Who controlled the night controlled the people. And sometimes, they sparked resentment. Records hint at riots where angry crowds refused to obey the bell, turning a safety rule into a spark for rebellion. Imagine yourself now, back in that medieval lane, hearing the last echoes of the bell fade. You hurry your steps, glancing at the shuttered windows around you. The air grows colder and the street empties fast. Doors slam, bolts slide into place, and the town transforms from bustling to silent in minutes. Only the glow of a few lanterns remains, swaying in the hands of watchmen. You can almost feel the collective breath of the community holding, waiting for dawn. Strange, isn't it? A single sound could dictate so much: your warmth, your safety, your freedom. The curfew bell was part alarm, part lullaby, part leash. Odd though it seems today, it helped medieval society survive the twin threats of fire and crime, and it gave people a rhythm in a world without clocks. You realize now, as you step indoors and pull the door tight against the night, that survival in the Middle Ages wasn't just about weapons or food. Sometimes it was about listening to the bell. You drift deeper into the medieval town, where the smell of wood smoke and tallow fades into something warmer, freshly baked bread. Your stomach growls because in this world bread isn't just food, it's survival itself. Grain was the heartbeat of medieval life, the difference between famine and feast, and everyone knew it. Which is why, as you soon discover, bread came with more rules than a tax ledger. Bakers lived under some of the strictest regulations of any medieval profession, and if they cheated, the punishment could be harsh, humiliating, and very, very public. Imagine yourself stepping up to a stall in the marketplace. Loaves of rye, barley, and coarse brown wheat bread are stacked like bricks, each one smelling faintly of smoke from the oven. The baker, sleeves rolled up and flour streaked across his forehead, eyes you nervously. Why? Because every loaf he sells has already been measured, weighed, and judged by law. He knows the town officials could appear at any moment to inspect his bread, and if it's even a little too light, he's in for trouble. This was the world of the assize of bread and ale, one of the most famous sets of regulations in medieval England, first issued in the 13th century. And though it sounds ridiculously fussy, regulating how much bread should weigh depending on the price of grain, it was deadly serious. People depended on bread for up to 3/4 of their daily calories. One bad harvest, one greedy baker skimping on flour, and entire families could go hungry. So the rule was simple in theory. Bakers couldn't just make bread any size they liked. The weight of a loaf had to change with the price of grain. If wheat was cheap, the loaf had to be heavier. If wheat was expensive, the loaf could be smaller. The price, though, stayed fixed. That way, no matter how markets shifted, the common person knew what to expect when they bought their daily bread. But here, the quirky tidbit. Bakers often gave customers an extra loaf for every dozen they bought, a practice known as the baker's dozen. Not out of generosity, mind you, but out of fear. If a baker shorted a customer by even a few ounces, the fines could be crushing. So they tossed in an extra loaf as insurance against the dreaded bread inspectors. Think about that next time you buy a donut dozen that comes with 13. Yes, that tradition is medieval. Of course, the laws weren't just about weights and measures. Officials actually walked into bakehouses, poked loaves with rods, sniffed at the crusts, and even broke bread apart to check for fraud. Some bakers tried to cut costs by mixing cheaper grains into the dough, rye, barley, even beans or peas. In desperate times, there are reports of bakers padding out flour with ground acorns or chalk. You bite into a hunk of that, and suddenly famine doesn't feel so theoretical anymore. Historians still argue whether these inspectors were genuinely effective, or whether bakers and officials often colluded under the table. Corruption was as common as mold on old rye after all. Yet the existence of such careful rules shows how vital bread was. It wasn't just food, it was politics. Town councils and kings knew that hungry people meant riots. Better to keep loaves steady, even if bakers grumbled. Let's walk with you into a public square, where today's unfortunate baker has been caught selling underweight bread. A crowd gathers. His loaves are confiscated and he's paraded in front of his neighbors. Sometimes the punishment is a fine. Sometimes it's worse. He's tied to a cart and dragged through the streets, a loaf of shame hung around his neck. In certain places, bakers were even forced to sit in a pillory with their bread on display, while children pelted them with rotten fruit. Imagine your career reputation boiling down to, oh yes, that's the guy who watered down the dough. Not exactly LinkedIn-worthy. And then there's one of the strangest punishments of all, the tumbrel. Picture a wooden cart dunking the guilty baker repeatedly into a filthy pond or river, the crowd cheering every splash. A soggy lesson in honesty and maybe also in hygiene. You probably wouldn't survive that humiliation, but hey, at least the bread laws kept famine at bay. Now the reality check. Bread wasn't equal for everyone. The wealthy ate fine white bread called manchet, sifted to remove the bran. It was soft, delicate, and more expensive, almost a status symbol in itself. Poorer folks ate darker loaves, coarse, dense, sometimes sour from rye or barley. And in hard years, when wheat harvests failed, everyone dropped to whatever grain they could find. Oats, peas, beans, even chestnuts went into desperate loaves. You think back to your modern supermarket, where shelves groan with sourdough, ciabatta, brioche, and gluten-free options, and you mutter, medieval folks would riot in here. The funny thing is, people did riot over bread. Grain shortages sparked uprisings across Europe. In France, one of the sparks of the later revolution was bread scarcity. Even centuries earlier, towns knew how dangerous an empty stomach could be. Better to punish a baker harshly than risk a mob tearing down the city gates. Here's another quirky aside. Some medieval sermons warned that bad bread wasn't just unhealthy, it was spiritually dangerous. Eating bread adulterated with false ingredients was compared to consuming sin. Priests thundered that bakers who cheated were like false prophets, mixing truth with lies. You can almost picture the friar wagging his finger from the pulpit, while half the congregation sneaks glances at the baker sitting red-faced in the pews. And here, where it gets even weirder, some towns had official bread tasters. Yes, real people appointed to chew and swallow on behalf of public trust. Their job was to ensure the bread wasn't fraudulent or poisonous. Imagine applying for that position. Occupation, professional bread chewer. Not a bad gig, unless you hit the unlucky loaf laced with ground beans and mildew. As you stand in the medieval square, you realize this rule, fussy, strict, sometimes cruel, was actually brilliant survival strategy. Bread wasn't just dinner, it was the fragile thread holding communities together. Regulate bread and you regulate peace. Let bakers cheat and society might starve. Historians still argue whether bakers truly lived in fear or whether punishments were mostly symbolic. Some say the bread police only swooped in during real shortages, when tempers ran high. Others insist the system was enforced year-round. But either way, it mattered. For peasants, knowing that their loaf would be honest weight gave them one less thing to fear in a world full of plagues, wars, and wolves. And for you, well, if you ever find yourself living back then, you'd better watch the scales carefully when buying bread. Because in this medieval town, every crumb carries law, order, and the echo of survival. You find yourself wandering deeper into the medieval town, past the busy marketplace where bread loaves are weighed with suspicious eyes, and guild masters argue over the price of wool. Tonight, though, your steps lead you into a quieter part of life, the world of marriage. And yes, brace yourself, because you might expect weddings in the Middle Ages to involve grand banquets, dowries in gold, and knights in shiny tunics. Sometimes they did. But the strangest, most survival-focused rule was that marriage, despite all the pomp surrounding it, boiled down to one startlingly simple thing: consent. Two people, a man and a woman, standing face to face, agreeing to live together as husband and wife. That's it. No bishop, no priest, no flowers, just words. It sounds shockingly modern, doesn't it? In fact, the medieval Catholic Church had to fight to protect this principle, because without clear consent, entire societies could unravel. If people could be married off like cattle, powerful families could control inheritances, land, and alliances without the faintest regard for personal choice. So the church came down firmly with a rule: marriage is valid only if both parties say yes. Not just don't say no, or remain quiet while your father barters away your hand, but an audible, voluntary yes. Picture this. You're in a small village, perhaps in Normandy or Bavaria, around the year 1200. A young man and woman step aside from their families just outside a wooden chapel. They clasp hands, sometimes it's a handshake, sometimes just fingers brushing, and one says in the local tongue, "I take you as my wife." The other replies, "I take you as my husband." Done. According to canon law, that's a marriage just as valid as any witnessed in a grand cathedral. Later, priests would bless the union, of course, but the church itself admitted the heart of the sacrament was consent, not ceremony. Now if you're thinking, wait, that's way too easy, doesn't that open the door to chaos? Yes, it absolutely did. Imagine teenagers sneaking off behind the hay barn, whispering vows just to test boundaries. Or worse, drunken villagers promising each other marriage in a tavern, with a tankard of ale spilling over the table. Historians still argue whether courts actually upheld these alleyway marriages, or whether families quietly erased them from memory. But records do exist of lawsuits where couples swore they'd exchanged vows, and suddenly inheritance disputes became battles of he said, she said. So why did the church stick to such a messy system? Because oddly enough, it helped society survive. When famine struck, when plagues swept through, when noblemen tried to force alliances, the idea of mutual consent gave at least a sliver of protection to the powerless. For a peasant girl, it meant her father couldn't just marry her off to an aging neighbor with 3 goats and rotting teeth, unless she actually agreed. For a second son of a noble house, it meant he could choose love over land. Of course, in reality, pressure was everywhere, but the rule existed and that mattered. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, people considered themselves married at the hearth. Couples would stand before a lit fireplace, declare their vows, and throw salt into the flames as a seal of union. Romantic, yes, but also practical. Salt was expensive, and wasting it showed seriousness. Imagine Tinder today requiring you to light a bonfire and toss Himalayan pink salt into it. Swipe left on that. Another fascinating wrinkle: consummation. Medieval canon lawyers spent centuries arguing over whether spoken vows alone created marriage, or whether the union wasn't fully sealed until the couple actually, well, you know. Cue endless debates in dusty monastic halls. Some jurists insisted that words were enough, others that the bed was essential. Historians still argue whether marriage by words or marriage by deed carried more legal weight, and courts occasionally had to investigate very personal matters. Let's just say medieval judges sometimes asked questions no one wants to answer in front of a notary. And you might chuckle at the thought, but this system also prevented a lot of political bloodshed. Imagine if kings could simply annul marriages whenever they wanted more land. In theory, once vows were spoken, even kings were bound. In practice, wealthy nobles still twisted rules, but the existence of canon law gave ordinary folks something to point to when resisting. That's survival, medieval style, wielding rules like shields. Now let's walk through the streets again. A wedding feast is happening and you smell roasted boar, hear the fiddles and drums, see women twirling in bright wool gowns. Everyone is laughing, drinking, and the bride is wearing a wreath of herbs instead of diamonds, parsley for luck, rosemary for fidelity. But deep down, the heart of this gathering rests on something invisible, the quiet words exchanged earlier. Even if the priest never showed up, even if the parchment was never signed, society would recognize this union. Of course, there were loopholes. Some people exploited the simplicity of consent to escape arranged marriages. Imagine a girl in a castle, promised to a man twice her age. She sneaks into the chapel at night with the squire she actually loves. They whisper vows under the stained glass, and suddenly, boom, they're married in the eyes of God. Now the Lord can't force her into another union without breaking canon law. It's a love story, but also a legal loophole. And here, where survival creeps back in, medieval society wasn't all about romance. It was about stability. By enforcing the principle of consent, communities reduced feuds over illegitimate marriages, clarified inheritance lines, and created rules that even ordinary villagers could understand. Without it, you'd have endless disputes over whether someone's daughter had been taken by another family against her will, or whether some lord's heir was legitimate. The system wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it prevented chaos. You might find it funny that in an age of superstition, where people used crocodile dung as sunscreen and believed comets caused plague, the one area of life that looked startlingly rational was marriage law. You, standing in that medieval crowd, would probably mutter, "Wow, they've got this one thing right," and then immediately step in a puddle of chamberpot waste dumped from a window because balance must be restored. And don't forget, the church also insisted these vows had to be spoken aloud. Silence was not enough. If you were mute or refused to speak, it caused problems. Some records show priests making signs with couples who couldn't talk, but canon lawyers fretted over whether gestures carried the same spiritual weight as words. Historians still argue whether marriages by gesture were ever officially recognized, but the very fact that people worried about it shows how central spoken consent was. Let's pause at one last quirky detail: secret marriages. Oh yes, the bane of medieval courts. Couples who didn't want their families to know would marry privately, then announce it later, usually when a child was already on the way. Communities hated this because it destabilized property rights. Imagine your neighbor suddenly claiming, "By the way, I married that widow last year, so her house is mine now." Chaos. So towns began keeping marriage registers, not just to bless unions, but to record them. You could say this was the medieval version of Facebook official. So there you are, strolling through this medieval town, realizing that survival wasn't only about food or clean water. It was also about rules that protected hearts, homes, and inheritances. Consent, that tiny word, became a fortress wall stronger than stone. You, if you lived back then, might grumble about muddy streets or the cost of salt, but at least you'd know your marriage was truly yours, spoken by your own lips, not bartered away at the market like a sack of grain. You wake the next morning with the sound of church bells drifting across the town, sunlight slanting through shutters, dust motes swirling in the air like tiny ghosts. As you step out onto the cobbled street, the first thing you notice isn't the smell of bread or the clatter of carts. It's the sheer variety of clothing brushing past you. Long woolen tunics dyed in muted browns and grays, aprons stained with ash from the baker's ovens, cloaks patched with more patches than cloth. But here and there, like sparks in the ashes, you glimpse flashes of crimson, velvet, or ermine trim. And immediately you realize something. In this world, what you wear isn't simply fashion, it's law. Yes, believe it or not, the Middle Ages were full of sumptuary laws, rules that dictated who could wear what. And while today you might see someone strut around in Gucci sneakers or a glittering knockoff watch without consequence, in the medieval world, flaunting the wrong silk or fur could earn you a fine, public shamming, or even jail time. It sounds absurd at first. Why should anyone care about a shoemaker's wife wearing pearls? But as you sink into the rhythm of this town, you discover that these strange rules actually helped society survive in ways both practical and psychological. Let's start with the basics. Medieval society was obsessed with hierarchy. Everyone, from the king at the top to the swineherd at the bottom, had their place. Clothing was a visual language, a quick shorthand that told you exactly who you were dealing with. Was that man a noble knight or just a wealthy merchant pretending above his station? Was that woman married into wealth or merely playing dress-up with contraband velvet? In a time before ID cards, LinkedIn profiles, or even reliable surnames, clothes were the medieval business card. So towns and kingdoms passed laws to keep fashion in its lane. A baker could wear wool but not silk. A merchant's daughter might wear modest jewelry but not gold chains fit for a baroness. If you earned more than a certain amount, you could afford better cloth. But even then, the law might forbid you from displaying it in public. It wasn't about whether you could afford velvet. It was about whether society thought you should. Now here's the quirky tidbit. In England under Edward III, women of common estate were forbidden to wear girdles garnished with silver. Imagine getting pulled over today for having chrome rims on your car because, sorry, you're only allowed hubcaps. In Italy, entire city councils were devoted to policing women's sleeves. Some towns even specified the maximum length of a train on a wedding gown. In Florence, bridesmaids once measured out the hem of rival brides just to report them to the authorities. Talk about medieval fashion police. Historians still argue whether these laws were truly enforced, or whether they served more as social pressure guidelines. After all, who was really going to check every hem, jewel, and embroidery thread? But court records do show that fines were levied, and tailors were sometimes punished for selling forbidden materials to the wrong clients. So yes, people cared enough to put it into writing, and enough to fight over it. You might ask, but why bother? Isn't this just elite snobbery? Well, partly yes. Nobles loved reminding everyone else that they were nobler than thou. But there was a survival reason too. In times of famine or war, when the line between rich and poor could blur dangerously, visible hierarchy helped preserve order. If a wealthy merchant could dress like a duke, how would anyone know who was entitled to command soldiers, who deserved deference in court, or who had the right to levy taxes? It sounds shallow, but visible class markers reduced confusion. Society, like an elaborate stage play, needed everyone to stay in costume. And don't forget the economic side. Luxuries like silk, velvet, and ermine were imported at enormous cost, often from the Far East or northern climates. By restricting their use, rulers hoped to prevent the middle classes from bankrupting themselves chasing status. Picture a medieval tailor whispering, "Buy this contraband satin, and everyone will think you're nobility." Families did exactly that, only to find themselves in debt. Laws tried, sometimes clumsily, to protect them. A kind of Consumer Protection Act, wrapped in snobbery. As you walk past the stalls in this bustling market, you overhear a tailor grumbling that he can't sell velvet to his best customers without risking a fine. He points to a bolt of deep blue fabric, shimmering like river water in sunlight. "Only knights and above may wear this shade," he mutters, rolling his eyes. Blue dye, extracted from woad or imported indigo, was rare and costly. Wearing it without permission could literally paint a target on your back. One of the stranger debates among scholars is whether these laws really reinforced morality. Preachers often warned that luxurious clothing led to vanity, lust, and ultimately sin. In sermons, friars railed against women whose sleeves were so wide they could hide loaves of bread inside. You can almost hear one scolding from the pulpit. "These garments could shelter a hen and her chicks." The congregation chuckles, but the message is clear: keep your clothes modest or risk your soul. Historians still argue whether this was genuine piety, or just another way to keep women under control. And here's a joke you can't resist. If you lived back then and you showed up to church in designer sneakers, some friar would absolutely accuse you of harboring demons in your shoelaces. And honestly, given the smell of medieval footwear, he might not be wrong. Let's step into the wealthy quarter of town. Here, houses have glazed windows, and the streets smell faintly less like chamber pots. You pass a noblewoman with a velvet gown that drags across the cobbles, her sleeves edged with white ermine fur. Children tug at the hem, marveling at how much fabric one person can waste. The gown announces her rank louder than any words could. Yet even she is bound by rules. She cannot wear certain crowns or jewels unless her husband holds a specific title. Imagine needing legal permission just to accessorize. Meanwhile, in the poorer district, women patch their husbands' tunics with whatever scraps they can find. Sometimes these scraps include forbidden colors, scavenged from cast-off noble garments. If the wrong sheriff notices, they can be fined even for recycling. You think again about survival, how every stitch of cloth carries both warmth and risk. What's really striking is how these laws reveal fear of social mobility. Medieval elites were terrified that merchants, bankers, or even successful artisans could rise too high too fast. If money alone could buy silk and jewels, what separated a noble knight from a guild master's son? The answer: rules. The laws didn't just preserve fashion, they preserved the fragile illusion of a world where everyone knew their place. And yet, despite all these rules, people constantly broke them. Chronicles are full of complaints. The wives of merchants dress like countesses, artisans parade in scarlet, young men strut in furs beyond their station. It seems human vanity always outruns law. In one case from Bologna, a judge fined a woman for wearing pearls above her station, only to have her husband argue that the pearls were fake. The judge, perhaps amused, reduced the fine. So yes, medieval knockoffs existed too. Call it the Louis Vuitton problem of the 14th century. You start to realize the irony. While the church insisted that marriage depended on something as pure as mutual consent, clothing laws screamed the opposite message. Appearances mattered more than reality. A poor man in velvet was an outlaw. A rich man in wool was simply modest. You wonder, wandering down the narrow streets, whether people resented these restrictions or secretly appreciated the order they brought. Historians still argue whether sumptuary laws were hated burdens or quiet comforts. And then you imagine yourself back home, standing in front of your closet. Jeans, hoodies, maybe a suit for weddings. Nothing that could get you arrested. In this medieval town, though, choosing your outfit could be a matter of life, death, or at least bankruptcy. You glance down at your shoes and mutter, "Okay, at least I'm not hiding a chicken in my sleeves." So in this strange world where every stitch tells a story, survival isn't just about bread or clean water. It's about blending into your role, following the script, and making sure the hem of your gown doesn't announce ambitions you can't afford. You turn a corner in the town square, expecting another market stall or maybe a blacksmith hammering sparks into the night. Instead, you stumble upon something far stranger, a crowd gathered outside the courthouse, murmuring with the kind of excitement that usually surrounds a festival or an execution. But there's no knight in chains, no thief in the stocks. Instead, standing awkwardly on its hind legs, squealing indignantly, is a pig. And yes, you're not dreaming, this pig is on trial. Welcome to one of the strangest customs of the Middle Ages, animal trials. You heard that right. For centuries across Europe, animals were formally charged with crimes, dragged into courtrooms, and judged with the same seriousness as human offenders. Pigs, rats, horses, even insects could be declared guilty, fined, or condemned to execution. It sounds absurd to your modern ears, like a Monty Python sketch that went too far. But in its own bizarre way, this system helped medieval communities survive. Let's paint the scene. The pig in front of you today stands accused of killing a child. The villagers whisper that the toddler wandered too close and the hungry swine lashed out. The law says this cannot go unpunished. The bailiff calls witnesses. The child's parents testify. The pig squeals loudly as if protesting its innocence. And then, because appearances matter, an actual lawyer stands beside the pig, tasked with defending it in court. Imagine being that lawyer, leaning down to whisper, "Don't worry, we'll get you acquitted." Why go through such ridiculous charades? Because medieval law was as much about symbolism as it was about justice. A crime unsettled the entire community, and leaving it unpunished risked curses, unrest, or vigilante revenge. By putting the animal on trial, the system restored balance. The child's death was acknowledged, justice was performed in public, and order was reestablished, even if the accused couldn't understand a single word of the proceedings. And these trials weren't rare curiosities. Records survive of dozens, maybe hundreds. In 1386, in the French town of Falaise, a pig was dressed in human clothes and hanged in the public square for killing a boy. The executioner was paid his full fee, the same as for a human criminal. Town officials even reimbursed him for the cost of the pig's outfit. Yes, someone signed off the paperwork for expenses. One child-sized tunic destroyed in hanging. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes animals got off scot-free. Rats, for instance, were often charged with stealing grain from barns. Judges would summon them to appear in court. Of course, the rats never showed up. Their defense lawyers, yes, really, argued that the summons hadn't been properly delivered to every rat, or that it was unsafe for them to travel through fields patrolled by cats. In one famous case in 1522, lawyer Bartholomew Chassanet won an acquittal for the rats of Autun by insisting that their failure to appear was understandable given the dangers of travel. Historians still argue whether Chassanet believed his own rhetoric, or whether he treated the case as a kind of legal satire. You can almost hear the sarcasm in his plea. "My clients are eager to attend, Your Honor, but alas, there are cats everywhere." The court took it seriously. After all, justice must be seen to be done, even if the defendants were furry and whiskered. Now, if you're chuckling, you're not alone. But to the medieval mind, this wasn't comedy. Animals were woven into daily life far more than today. Pigs roamed the streets as living garbage disposals. Horses carried armies, plows, and trade goods. Rats infested granaries, threatening the survival of entire villages. When an animal stepped out of line, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat to the community's fragile stability. Trying them in court was a way to tame that chaos, to place even beasts within the framework of law. And yet there's something almost touching about it. By putting animals on trial, humans acknowledge them as moral agents, beings capable of causing harm, and therefore subject to judgment. In a strange way, it blurred the line between human and beast. Historians still argue whether this reflects superstition, theology, or an early attempt at environmental law. Were these people deluded, or were they grappling with the same questions we face today? How to live alongside animals that shape our world. Let's wander with you into another trial. This time, the defendants are weevils accused of destroying vineyards. The farmers cry out that their crops are ruined, their livelihood gone. The judge solemnly appoints a lawyer to speak for the insects. The lawyer argues that, as God's creatures, the weevils have as much right to eat the grapes as humans do. In some cases, courts even tried to negotiate with the pests, offering them alternative plots of land. Picture a medieval notary writing, "Parcel of barren soil, hereby granted to the community of weevils in perpetuity." It's absurd, yes, but also astonishingly respectful of nature. Of course, not every animal trial ended with clever legal gymnastics. Most pigs convicted of attacking children were executed, often by hanging or burning as though they were human murderers. Communities needed closure and spectacle mattered. Public executions reinforced the idea that justice was impartial. If a pig killed a child, the pig died like a criminal. The message was clear. No one, not even an animal, could escape the law. Here's a joke to lighten it. Imagine the pig's lawyer billing hours. Consultation with client, squealing uncontrollably. Court preparation, attempted translation of grunts. Not exactly the resume builder you want. But let's not lose sight of survival. These trials, strange as they seem, played a crucial role. They prevented vendettas. Imagine if the child's family, denied justice, decided to kill all pigs in the village. That would devastate food supplies. By focusing anger on one symbolic offender, the law preserved order and prevented chaos. A single pig was sacrificed so the herd could live. And the trials reinforced theology too. Medieval Christianity taught that sin corrupted all creation, not just humans. When animals transgressed, it was a reminder that the world itself was fallen. Punishing them was less about logic than about dramatizing the struggle between order and chaos, good and evil. Historians still argue whether peasants truly believed animals deserved punishment, or whether the spectacle was more for the living than the condemned. As you shuffle with the crowd out of the courthouse, you notice the townsfolk whispering not about the pig's guilt, it was obvious to them, but about whether the execution will be swift. They're half horrified, half entertained. In a society without television, trials like these were public theater. Everyone played their part, the judge in robes, the defense lawyer making solemn arguments, the bailiff struggling to keep the animal in place. And then at the end, the grim execution, sending the message that justice was blind, and occasionally a little absurd. Walking away, you glance at the marketplace again. A rat scurries between stalls, unbothered by the verdicts of human courts. Somewhere, a pig roots happily in the mud, blissfully unaware of its cousin's fate. And you realize, in a world so precarious where death and hunger always lurked, people clung to rituals that gave meaning, even if it meant putting a pig in the dock. So the next time you see a courtroom drama on TV, remember, at least the defendant can talk back. In medieval towns, sometimes the accused could only squeal. The fire is low in the hearth and the long day of toil has finally ebbed into silence. Your stomach growls, a reminder that the day's bread was thin, the broth watery. You glance at the corner where a jug of ale rests, where a small hunk of cheese waits in the shadows. Every instinct tells you to reach for it. But then, like a whisper, you remember the rule. The bell has rung. The curfew has fallen. The church has forbidden eating at night. You lean back, torn between hunger and fear. For in the medieval world, eating after dark wasn't merely frowned upon. It was dangerous, sinful, even outright forbidden. To understand this peculiar rule, you have to step into a world where food was never just food. It was medicine, morality, and magic all at once. People didn't eat simply to fill their stomachs. They ate to balance their humors, to avoid temptation, to keep their souls and bodies in harmony. And night was considered a perilous time, when both the body and the spirit were at their weakest. Let's set the stage. The doctrine of the four humors, inherited from the ancient Greeks and polished by medieval physicians, dominated every thought about health. Your body, they believed, was made of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much or too little of any one created sickness. Food was thought to tip this delicate balance. Bread might strengthen, beans might cause wind, meat could inflame passions. And eating late in the day, that risked upsetting digestion itself. The stomach, they said, became sluggish at night. A full belly during sleep would churn food improperly, breeding vapors that rose to the head, fogging the brain and causing nightmares, or worse, madness. Doctors warned, never go to bed stuffed. The body needed fasting to purify itself. Night feasts were accused of causing everything from gout to melancholy to sudden death. And remember, in an age without refrigeration, food left sitting was dangerous. Eating it by firelight, half-spoiled and poorly cooked, truly could make you sick. So what looked like superstition often masked real survival instincts. But the ban on night eating wasn't only medical, it was also moral. The church frowned upon late feasts for reasons far beyond digestion. Night was associated with sin. Think of it, torches flickering, ale flowing, bellies full, inhibitions gone. Too many stories began with after supper and ended with scandal. To eat and drink late was to court gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins. Worse, it could lead to lust, another deadly trap. So rules grew strict. Monasteries set the standard, forbidding meals after vespers, insisting on early suppers in silence. Ordinary villagers were expected to imitate, keeping their main meal at midday, a lighter supper before sunset, and then nothing. If you were caught feasting after dark, tongues wagged. Were you a glutton, a drunkard? Were you secretly plotting? Imagine yourself walking through a medieval town after curfew. The streets are dark, the only light from a distant church lamp. And then, faintly, you hear laughter. Someone is breaking the rule. Behind a shuttered window, neighbors are gathered, sharing bread, cheese, and wine. It feels deliciously rebellious and dangerous, for authorities often equated night gatherings with disorder, conspiracy, or heresy. Eating together after dark could be interpreted as more than just hunger. It could mean you were plotting against the peace. And so, night feasts became rituals of suspicion. Yet humans are humans. People broke the rule constantly. Travelers arriving after sundown needed food. Workers finishing long harvest days demanded sustenance. Celebrations, weddings, and holy days stretched late into the night. And taverns, they lived on forbidden feasting, offering ale and roasted meats when the rest of the town slept. Officials often looked the other way until things got rowdy. But here, where the story deepens, the fear of night feasts also reflected deeper anxieties about the body and the soul. In Christian teaching, the night belonged to prayer, not indulgence. Midnight was the hour of vigil, when monks rose from their beds to chant psalms. To fill the night with laughter and feasting was to crowd out God. It was a rival liturgy, a worship of the stomach instead of the spirit. And in an age where every act carried cosmic weight, even a piece of cheese after dark felt like rebellion against heaven. Of course, rules varied. Wealthy nobles often ignored them, dining late with elaborate banquets that stretched for hours. Candlelight, musicians, dancers, platters of roasted boar, this was their theater of power. For them, eating late was a luxury, proof that they could afford the best meats, the finest spices, the most servants to keep the hall blazing with light long past curfew. To peasants, it was sin. To lords, it was spectacle. The double standard was as thick as the gravy on their trenchers. And yet, even among the nobility, there was unease. Physicians whispered warnings. Priests muttered sermons. Writers satirized the bloated aristocrat who stumbled to bed drunk and heavy with meat. The message was clear. Late feasting was excess, and excess was dangerous. You, as an observer, begin to notice how rules about eating are really rules about control. By dictating when, how, and with whom you could eat, the church and community shaped daily life. To forbid night feasts was to force order upon chaos, to guard against illness, sin, and sedition. The rule existed for a really good reason, not because bread after sundown was inherently wicked, but because hunger, community, and darkness were powerful forces, and unchecked, they could unravel fragile society. Let's not forget the folklore. People whispered that evil spirits were strongest at night. Eating late could draw them near. A heavy meal might weigh down the soul, making it easier for demons to tempt you in your dreams. Nightmares weren't just indigestion. They were assaults from the devil himself. Better to go to bed hungry but holy than full and vulnerable. And yet in secret, people feasted anyway. Villagers snuck scraps to eat by the fire. Couples shared quiet bites in the shadows. And travelers carried hard bread and cheese, munching quietly under the stars. These forbidden meals were charged with intimacy, a sense of stolen pleasure. To eat after dark was to flirt with danger, both physical and spiritual. Picture this: you are invited to such a feast. The shutters are drawn. A single candle glows, bread is broken, wine poured. Every laugh is hushed, every bite both delicious and risky. Outside, the town is silent, the bell long since rung. But here in this room, rules bend. Hunger is satisfied, community thrives. The forbidden becomes nourishment, not just for the stomach, but for the soul. Over time, of course, the rules softened. By the late Middle Ages, especially in cities, night eating became more common. Taverns flourished, feasts stretched longer, and the strict division between day meals and night fasting blurred. But the echoes remained. Even today, you hear whispers of it in advice not to eat before bed, in the idea that midnight snacks are unhealthy, in the lingering guilt of opening the fridge at 2 a.m. So next time you're tempted by a late-night bite, imagine the shadow of a medieval monk scolding you, warning of vapors rising to your brain, demons whispering in your sleep. And then imagine the villager slipping bread under the blanket, savoring the forbidden crumb, laughing softly at the rules that tried to tame hunger. Because in the end, medieval bans on night feasts tell you less about food than about fear. Fear of illness, of sin, of disorder. And yet, they also reveal resilience. For no matter how strict the rule, the people still found ways to feast in the dark. And you, sitting by the dying fire, stomach growling, must choose. Obey the rule or break it with one stolen bite. The hall is crowded with voices, laughter, and the crackle of firelight bouncing off tapestries. You stand in the middle of it all, a little nervous, a little amused, because tonight you're about to witness something not quite marriage and not quite courtship, a ritual the medieval world called hand fasting. Two people step forward, their hands joined, bound loosely with a ribbon. There's no priest, no elaborate altar, no crowd of solemn witnesses. Just a knot of friends and family, a murmur of words, and a quiet understanding. For 1 year and 1 day, these two will live as husband and wife. After that, they can choose to remain together or walk away. It feels strange to modern ears, doesn't it? As if marriage were a trial subscription. But in the Middle Ages, hand fasting was both a practical and symbolic ritual, a way to test compatibility in a world where family alliances, property rights, and survival itself depended on the strength of a union. You picture yourself in that world. No dating apps, no candle-lit restaurants, no months of casual coffee dates. Marriage was serious business, often arranged, often binding. And yet, tucked into this rigid system was a curious custom that allowed couples an exit door. Hand fasting was essentially a marriage on probation, and it served society in odd but clever ways. The ceremony itself varied. Sometimes it was formal, with hands tied together and vows exchanged. Other times it was as simple as a verbal agreement in front of witnesses. I take thee to be my wedded spouse for a year and a day. That phrase, a year and a day, shows up repeatedly in medieval records like a magical number, long enough to test the union through all seasons, short enough to release without scandal. Historians still argue whether hand fasting was legally binding. Some claim it was as valid as church marriage. Others insist it was more like betrothal. The church, unsurprisingly, disliked it since it sidestepped priestly authority, but ordinary people embraced it. After all, not every couple could afford church weddings, dowries, or elaborate feasts. Hand fasting was cheap, flexible, and rooted in community trust. Imagine being a young woman whose family can't scrape together a dowry, or a man with little land but steady hands. The chance to marry on trial offers hope. You bind your hands, you share a household, you try to raise food, manage chores, live as one. If it works, wonderful. The union can be blessed formally later. If it fails, the couple parts ways, the community shrugs, and life goes on. No annulments, no endless court battles, no scandal. Practical, isn't it? And yet beneath that practicality there was always tension. Because if a child was born during the year, questions arose. Was the child legitimate? Could inheritance follow? Some communities accepted hand-fasting children as rightful heirs. Others demanded a church wedding to secure their future. You can almost hear the whispers at the hearth. Did they stay together for the baby, or because they actually liked each other? One quirky tidbit: the ritual of hand fasting wasn't limited to peasants. Even nobles occasionally used it, though usually in scandalous ways. Records tell of lords who hand-fasted mistresses, claiming later it was only for a year, or ladies who found themselves in messy disputes when trial marriages overlapped with arranged alliances. The church thundered against this, declaring hand-fasting a gateway to sin. But as always, people quietly continued the practice anyway. Picture the scene again. The hands bound with ribbons symbolize union, but also the freedom of choice. A year and a day later, the couple returns to the same place, ribbon in hand, decision on their lips. If they remain bound, the ribbon is tied anew, this time tighter, sanctified by priest or law. If not, the ribbon is untied, the couple thanks each other, and they walk away. Public, simple, and surprisingly humane for an age we often paint as brutal. Why did it matter so much? Because in medieval society, survival often depended on partnership. A bad match wasn't just sad. It could ruin a harvest, shatter alliances, burden families with debt. Hand fasting gave communities a safety valve. It prevented hasty, disastrous unions from being locked forever. Think of it as an early version of compatibility testing, except with bread ovens and oxen instead of dating profiles. There's also a deeper cultural resonance. In many pagan traditions, hand fasting was sacred. The ribbon or cord binding the couple represented spiritual union, not just legal contract. Echoes of this lingered long into Christian Europe, and even today, some modern weddings revive hand fasting as a romantic gesture. The medieval custom may have faded, but its imagery survived, like an old melody woven into new songs. Now, as you watch this couple smile nervously at each other, you sense the tension of the crowd. Some whisper blessings, others roll eyes. For every successful hand fast, there were failures. Lovers who fought, who split bitterly, who dragged disputes before courts. And yet, even those failures provided lessons. Communities could see which alliances worked, which didn't, without paying the full cost of permanence. Historians still argue whether hand fasting was ever officially sanctioned or simply tolerated. Some evidence suggests church authorities occasionally blessed it, especially in remote areas where priests were scarce. Others insist it was always on the edge, half legal, half taboo. But in practice, people did it, and that's often what matters more than official doctrine. You can't help but compare it to your own time. The trial period, the test relationship, the cohabitation before marriage, all echoes of this medieval habit. Humans have always wanted to test love before sealing it in permanence. The difference is, medieval people wrapped it in ritual, gave it structure, and made it a public affair. No sneaking around, your hand fast was as visible as the ribbon binding your wrists. There's humor in it too. Imagine a jester cracking jokes during a hand-fasting feast. Don't tie it too tight. You might want your hand back in a year. Or neighbors muttering, let's see if they survive the first winter without killing each other. In a way, the entire community watched the experiment, curious whether it would thrive or crumble. But here's the tender side. For some couples, hand-fasting was the only chance to marry for love. Formal alliances were often dictated by families, but hand-fasting offered a loophole. A boy and girl, drawn together by affection rather than strategy, could bind hands, live a year, and then plead their case. See, we make it work. Sometimes the community listened. Sometimes even families relented. A ribbon could prove what whispered words alone could not. And so hand-fasting, odd as it sounds, helped medieval society balance order with flexibility. It protected inheritance, but it also protected love. It gave people a taste of freedom in a world of rules. It wasn't perfect. Children complicated it, priests scolded it, gossips mocked it. But it endured for centuries because it answered a simple truth. Humans need ways to test the bonds that hold them together. As the ribbon is tied tonight, you feel the weight of that truth. The young couple gaze at each other, unsure what the year will bring. Hardship, joy, quarrels, laughter. By this time next year, they'll know, and so will everyone else. And you, slipping back into the shadows, can't help but wonder. If your own fate were bound for a year and a day, what would you choose at the end? You wander now into the bustling streets of a medieval town, and the first thing you notice isn't the noise of hooves clattering on cobblestones, or even the smell of roasting meat drifting from a cookshop. It's the sound of hammers. Hammers, saws, chisels, and the scrape of whetstones, all of them working together in a kind of rough orchestra of labor. You pause and look around, and it strikes you how controlled the chaos really is. Every trade, every workshop, every little craft seems to be organized, as though invisible strings guide each worker's hand. That's because, in truth, they are. Those strings are called guild rules. A guild is not just a workplace union, though it does look a bit like one if you squint from a modern perspective. Think of it as a powerful combination of neighborhood club, business association, religious order, and yes, strict parental figure. If you were a carpenter, a baker, a shoemaker, or a stonemason in this world, your guild was everything. Without it, you couldn't legally work, sell your wares, or even call yourself by your trade. You'd just be a nobody with a hammer, a man or woman holding tools but barred from using them in the market. And of course, you weren't going to argue with the guild because the guild wasn't some distant king's decree. It was your own peers, the masters and journeymen who literally lived next door to you. Their rules were your survival. Break them and you might find your shop mysteriously empty of customers. Or worse, your goods seized, your membership revoked, your livelihood vanished. Now, at first glance, these rules may sound stifling. But here's the catch. They helped medieval society survive in ways you might not expect. You shuffle along past a blacksmith's forge, where sparks leap like fireflies against the gloom. Inside, the master smith has pinned up a parchment on the wall, inked in careful hand, the official price of horseshoes set by the guild. No smith is allowed to undercut another. At first, you might laugh at this. So much for free market capitalism, right? But think about it. In a world without supermarkets, safety inspectors, or consumer watchdogs, one greedy smith could destroy the trust of an entire community. Imagine buying a cheap horseshoe that snaps mid-ride, sending you face first into the mud, or worse, breaking your only horse's leg. With guild rules, you didn't have to guess at quality. You knew that every smith, every cobbler, every brewer was held to the same standard. Historians still argue whether guilds stifled innovation or protected it. On one hand, the rigid rules sometimes meant craftsmen weren't free to experiment wildly. On the other, the very stability of guild regulation allowed trades to thrive over centuries. It's like deciding whether you want the chaos of a free-for-all food festival or the reassuring consistency of grandma's cooking. Both have their charms, But in a world where a bad loaf of bread could literally kill you, predictability wasn't boring, it was survival. You pass a bakery next, and the smell of warm bread wraps around you like a blanket. Bakers, of course, had some of the strictest guilds of all. In London, for example, the worshipful company of bakers could fine or even flog a baker who cheated on weight. And there's that word again, weight. It's always about measurements. Medieval people weren't just obsessed with fairness, they were obsessed with certainty. Bread was so important to diet that a short-weight loaf was practically a crime against humanity. So guild inspectors marched through the streets, scales in hand, ready to check if today's loaf was truly worth the penny stamped on it. Imagine trying to sneak a smaller cookie past a modern Costco sample lady, except now she has legal authority to confiscate your oven. Apprenticeship was another great rule-driven survival trick. If you wanted to learn a craft, you couldn't just show up and shadow someone. No, you were bound by contracts. Usually, your parents signed you over as a child, often at the age of 12 or 13, to live in a master's household. And when I say live, I don't mean 9 to 5, I mean full immersion. You slept above the shop, you ate at the master's table, you wore his livery. And you followed the guild rules that governed every step of your progress. It could take 7 years before you were released as a journeyman, free to wander and hire yourself out to other shops. 7 years. You probably wouldn't even survive 7 days without grumbling about how unpaid internships are unfair. But back then, this system wasn't about exploitation, it was about stability. By binding you to rules, the guild guaranteed your training was real, not just a cheap shortcut. There's a quirky tidbit here too. Some guilds had elaborate initiation ceremonies. The records are patchy, but stories survive of pranks played on apprentices, involving secret handshakes, mock trials, and even symbolic ordeals, like being locked in a dark room with animal bones to test your bravery. Were these true? Historians still argue whether these initiation rituals were widespread or just legends passed down. Either way, they reinforced the idea that you weren't just learning a skill, you were entering a family. And speaking of family, the guild wasn't just your work life. It was also your insurance policy. If you fell sick, the guild collected funds to help you. If you died, the guild paid for your funeral. And let's be blunt, death came knocking often in the Middle Ages. Without guild solidarity, widows and children of craftsmen might starve. With it, they had at least some safety net. In a sense, the guild was the medieval version of both an HMO and a neighborhood GoFundMe. Of course, these rules sometimes veered into the downright weird. Take, for example, the rule that some guilds had forbidding members to work at night. It sounds silly. Why not burn some midnight oil if orders piled up? But night work carried risks. Candlelight was poor, accidents were common, and fire hazards were everywhere. And since towns were tightly packed tinderboxes, one smith's burning shop could become half a city's funeral pyre. So, no matter how ambitious you were, guild rules reminded you that your individual hustle wasn't worth the collective risk. Other guild rules were intensely moral. A guild might forbid its members from gambling, from swearing in public, or from skipping church services. You might think, what does that have to do with shoemaking? But remember, the guild wasn't just a trade organization. It was also a brotherhood, and sometimes a sisterhood too. Maintaining moral order was as important as maintaining quality of goods. They were convinced that a sinful shoemaker would produce sinful shoes, and nobody wanted to risk a pair of boots cursed with blasphemy. There's a moment as you walk further down the street where you glance up and notice the town's tallest building rising above the rooftops, the cathedral spire gleaming in the sun. And here, where another layer of guild rules comes in, civic pride. Many guilds were responsible for funding parts of those great cathedrals, paying for stained glass windows, chapels, or even entire towers. Why? Because being a member wasn't just about earning wages. It was about displaying to God, your neighbors, and posterity that your craft mattered. If you were a stonemason, you wanted your mark carved into that holy structure. If you were a brewer, maybe you funded a chapel so that thirsty pilgrims would toast your soul for centuries to come. But of course, Not everything was noble. Guild rules could be cutthroat, designed to squash competition. If an outsider tried to set up shop in your town without permission, the guild could literally chase him out. In some places, they even destroyed rival goods in dramatic bonfires, all perfectly legal under guild charters. Historians still argue whether this was protectionism gone mad or simply the only way to keep quality high. Imagine if today's coffee shop owners had the legal right to storm into Starbucks with torches and dump the beans in the river. You get the picture. You pause now in the marketplace square, watching a line of young apprentices carrying trays of goods on their shoulders. Each one is branded literally with a badge showing their guild symbol, a hammer, a sheaf of wheat, a barrel, a boot. These symbols weren't just decoration. They were promises. When you bought something marked with the guild sign, you trusted it. It's almost like the medieval version of Amazon reviews, except instead of one-star rants about shipping delays, you got a loaf of bread that wouldn't poison you and shoes that wouldn't collapse in the mud. And perhaps the oddest rule of all, guilds sometimes ban their members from advertising. You heard that right. No flashy signs, no buy one, get one free, no hustling the crowd with catchy jingles. The quality of the work was supposed to speak for itself. In theory, that meant everyone competed only on skill, not noise. In practice, it probably meant medieval streets were just a bit quieter than your average shopping mall. By the time you finish your walk through this imaginary town, the rhythm of guild life has settled into you. The rules may sound bizarre, even suffocating, but they gave structure in a world that might otherwise collapse into chaos. Imagine living in a place where every shoe fit, every beer tasted right, every loaf weighed true, and every carpenter's beam could hold the weight of a roof without killing you. In a society constantly flirting with famine, disease, and war, guild rules weren't just bureaucratic nitpicking. They were lifelines. And as you drift further along the street, leaving behind the hammering, the bread-smelling air, and the sharp hiss of bellows, you realize something simple but profound. The very predictability that might bore you today was exactly what allowed medieval people to wake up tomorrow. The bells toll again, long and low, their echo shivering across rooftops, rolling through narrow lanes and curling into the windows of houses where shutters creak against the morning breeze. You stop, tilt your head, and realize something strange. The hammering of blacksmiths has fallen silent. The shutters of bakeries remain closed. The market square lies empty, save for a few pigeons strutting on cobblestones like tiny kings. Today is not an ordinary day. Today, nobody is working. It isn't laziness, nor is it some early version of a 3-day weekend. It is, quite simply, a holy day, a day when the medieval world collectively shut down, whether you liked it or not. And if you tried to sneak in a little extra profit, rolling dough in secret or sawing beams behind your shop door, you were breaking more than guild rules. You were violating sacred law, and sometimes even civil law. The strange custom of forbidding work on holy days may sound quaint in a world where half of us reply to emails while brushing our teeth. But for medieval people, it was survival. Spiritual survival, yes, but also physical survival. Imagine you're a peasant farmer, sunburnt and weary, your back bent from weeks in the fields. For you, the holy day wasn't a burden, it was salvation. It meant a guaranteed pause, a rest your body desperately craved. It meant, at least for a while, no lord demanding labor, no overseer cracking his stick. Even the cows seemed grateful, chewing cud a little more slowly while you leaned against the fence with your hands free. Now here's a fact to anchor us. In many parts of medieval Europe, the church calendar included upwards of 50 to 100 holy days a year, sometimes even more depending on the region. That's in addition to Sundays, which were already work-free. In some lucky stretches, peasants might find themselves laboring barely half the year. Historians still argue whether this time off was really restful. After all, peasants still had animals to feed and chores to do, or whether it masked the grinding reality that time not spent earning wages was time spent hungrier. Still, the principle stands. Enforced pauses helped prevent burnout. In a world with no labor unions, no 8-hour workdays, no HR department reminding bosses about Mental Health Awareness Month, the church stepped in as the ultimate manager of time. You stroll further into the square and notice processions forming, men and women in rough woolen tunics, children carrying candles, priests in embroidered vestments holding relics high for everyone to see. On holy days, labor ceased not just so people could nap, but so they could join the great pageantry of the church. It was about visibility. The world had to stop working so it could face God. There's a quirky tidbit here worth smiling at. In some places, even animals weren't supposed to labor on holy days. Oxen were left unyoked, horses unbridled. Sometimes even chickens were said to be spared from being slaughtered on the most solemn feasts. Whether this was strict rule or local custom, it shows how the medieval mind extended sacred rest to the whole ecosystem of daily life. Imagine being a lucky ox, blissfully unaware that your reprieve from plowing had been scheduled by a saint. And yet the no-work rule could be as practical as it was spiritual. Take the danger of fire. Blacksmiths, forges, bakers, ovens, candle makers, workshops, all of these were tinderboxes waiting to ignite. A town in flames was not uncommon. Forcing all forges and ovens to stay cold on holy days reduced that risk, at least temporarily. Safety regulations cloaked in religious ritual. That's medieval efficiency at its best. The silence of labor also created space for community. You might think of holy days as endless prayers, but they were also opportunities for festivals, for theater plays staged on wagon platforms, for feasts where ale flowed and music stirred weary feet into dancing. Yes, the church sometimes scolded the excesses, preachers railing against drunken revelry, but deep down, everyone knew joy was part of survival too. Work alone could not sustain the spirit. You needed a bonfire, a jug of ale, a shared laugh. But of course, not everyone loved these rules. Lords sometimes fumed at idle peasants. Merchants lost profits when markets were closed. Some workers, desperate for coin, risked sneaking inside jobs, hammering quietly behind shuttered doors. And there are records of towns fining people caught working on a holy day, proof that not everyone obeyed willingly. Historians still argue whether these laws reflected genuine devotion or whether the church cleverly used them to flex power over society. After all, controlling people's time is one of the strongest powers any institution can wield. You lean against a wall now and picture a medieval mason, halfway through carving a saint's face on a cathedral facade, forced to lay down his chisel because it's St. Bartholomew's feast day. The stone waits, the saint's nose half-formed, the mason restless. But he knows the rule. He steps away, attends mass, joins the procession, maybe sneaks a drink at the alehouse. Work halted for faith, but also halted for rhythm. It's like the heartbeat of medieval life. Labor, pause, labor, pause. Without that rhythm, the body and the community might collapse. Here's another angle. These rules also created predictable time markers in a world without calendars on kitchen walls. For ordinary folk, who often couldn't read or write, knowing when to rest, when to feast, and when to labor was dictated by the ringing of bells and the cycle of saints' days. You didn't need a smartphone reminder, you just needed ears. You remember that earlier section, when bread was weighed to exact measures. Think of this as time weighed out to exact measures. Holy days regulated not just what you ate, but how you lived each hour. And yet, the system wasn't without loopholes. Some holy days were downgraded in importance over time, others blurred into local fairs, and in some places the church and crown clashed over just how many days off people could afford. In England, for example, by the late Middle Ages, complaints grew that too many feast days drained productivity. Eventually, reformers like those during the Protestant Reformation would rail against excessive idleness, hacking the holy days calendar down to size. Imagine the outrage, like your boss suddenly canceling half your vacation days because he thought you were loafing. Still, for centuries, the rule of no work on holy days helped hold the fragile balance of body, soul, and community. It gave peasants their only predictable rest. It gave towns a fire break from daily risk. It gave neighbors a chance to laugh together under pennants strung across the square. And above all, it gave people the reassuring rhythm of life marked not by endless toil, but by pauses sanctified in bells. As you drift further into this imagined town, you notice shutters close not in gloom but in peace. The hammer lies idle, the loom stands still, the oven cools. And for a moment you almost envy them, the certainty that when the bells toll, the world must breathe. You hear laughter before you see the crowd. Not the warm, rolling laughter of shared jokes at a feast, but the sharp, biting laughter of people pressing forward in a marketplace, pointing, jeering, calling out insults that sting like thrown pebbles. You push closer, curiosity dragging you, and there it is. A wooden platform in the square with a man locked in the pillory, his arms and neck trapped between heavy timbers. His face is red, not just from shame but from the tomatoes, or perhaps less pleasant projectiles, hurled at him by passers-by. This, you realize, is one of the strangest and yet most effective survival customs of the Middle Ages: public shamming punishments. It sounds cruel, doesn't it? Today we think of justice as something cold, impersonal, tucked away in courts and prisons, shielded from public eyes. But in the medieval world, punishment wasn't hidden. It was theater, raw and visible, and you were part of the audience whether you wanted to be or not. And strangely enough, this humiliation helped societies survive, not because it hurt individuals, but because it reinforced the invisible web of rules that kept fragile communities from splintering apart. Imagine living in a small town of a few hundred people. Everyone knows everyone else. There are no massive cities where anonymity lets you vanish into the crowd. No, if you steal your neighbor's chicken, everyone will hear of it by sundown. If you sell watered-down ale, tongues will wag. And if the court convicts you, they'll drag you not into a hidden cell but into the sunlight of the market square. Take the pillory and the stocks, for instance. These wooden contraptions weren't just about immobilizing a wrongdoer, they were about displaying him. The point was less about physical pain and more about exposure. By standing there helpless, you became a living lesson. Don't do what I did or this will be you. Here's a solid historical fact. In medieval England, stocks and pillories were legally mandated punishments for minor offenses ranging from cheating at weights and measures to spreading false rumors. The punishment could last hours or even days, depending on the crime. And yes, locals were encouraged to pelt offenders with rotten food, mud, or worse. You weren't just being punished by the law, you were being punished by your own neighbors. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Sometimes, the public turned the tables. There are records of communities refusing to jeer, even quietly supporting the person in the pillory if they thought the punishment unfair. Imagine a baker accused of short-weight loaves during a bad harvest. Villagers who knew the truth might slip him food or cheer him on instead of mocking. In other words, public shamming sometimes backfired, transforming into public solidarity. You could argue the pillory wasn't just a punishment device. It was a poll of public opinion, a medieval like or dislike button written in mud and turnips. But why did this matter for survival? Because prisons were rare and costly. Towns couldn't afford to house and feed wrongdoers for months on end. Execution was too extreme for minor crimes. So the middle ground was humiliation, a punishment that cost almost nothing, reinforced social boundaries, and reminded everyone of the rules. In a world where order was fragile, a laughing crowd was a cheaper tool than a gallows. You step back now and notice another contraption, this one less famous but just as odd. The scold's bridle, also called the brank. It was a metal cage locked around the head, with a spiked bit pressed into the mouth to silence a quarrelsome woman or, in some records, a gossip. To us it looks barbaric, and it was. But the reasoning, however twisted, was survival-driven. In small towns, rumors could destroy reputation, spark feuds, or incite violence. Controlling gossip through humiliation was seen as protecting community peace. Historians still argue whether such devices were widespread or rare curiosities exaggerated by later writers. But the fact that they existed at all tells you how far communities went to keep harmony. And then there were the cucking stools, a punishment that might make you chuckle until you imagine enduring it yourself. The offender, often accused of being a scold, a cheat, or a prostitute, was strapped into a chair attached to a long wooden beam. Then the chair was dunked repeatedly into a river or pond while crowds roared with laughter. It wasn't designed to kill, though accidents surely happened. It was designed to humiliate, to leave you dripping wet and disgraced. The water washed away not just dirt but reputation, and everyone knew it. Now pause for a moment and imagine the sensory details. The cold slap of water stealing your breath, the stink of river muck clinging to your clothes, the roar of jeering voices echoing in your ears. Then imagine walking home afterward, dripping and shivering, as children pointed and whispered. That humiliation would follow you longer than any bruise. But perhaps the strangest part is how these punishments sometimes turned festive. Markets halted, musicians played, and crowds treated it like free entertainment. A public shamming became a kind of carnival, a chance for everyone to vent frustrations, to laugh at someone else's misfortune. Was it cruel? Certainly. But it also diffused tensions. Instead of simmering resentment exploding into violence, villagers threw turnips at a petty thief and went home satisfied. A strange pressure valve, but an effective one. Of course, not everyone agrees this was healthy. Historians still debate whether public shamming strengthened communities or bred cruelty. Some argue it normalized mob behavior, teaching people to enjoy another's suffering. Others point out that for most minor crimes, it was a far lighter punishment than whipping or mutilation, which were also on the legal menu. Think of it as a medieval choice between rotten tomatoes and chopped-off ears. Which would you prefer? There's also the unsettling truth that public shamming wasn't always fair. The poor and powerless faced it more often than the wealthy. A noble caught in scandal could often pay a fine in private, while a peasant faced the pillory. Justice was not blind. It was all too aware of your status. Still, the custom survived for centuries, precisely because it fit the needs of small, close-knit communities. Shamming didn't just punish. It reminded everyone that survival depended on trust. If you couldn't trust your neighbor not to cheat or lie, society might collapse. A jeering crowd, for all its cruelty, was society protecting itself. You picture the man in the pillory again, his face dripping with egg yolk, his pride shattered. Tomorrow he'll be free, back in the market, selling his wares again. The punishment didn't destroy him. It folded him back into the community, scarred but still functional. Odd as it sounds, shamming wasn't about exile. It was about reintegration. And as the crowd disperses, you realize that these strange punishments, rooted in humiliation, were never about sadism alone. They were about survival, about making sure a fragile society could keep walking forward without losing itself to endless revenge, prisons it couldn't afford, or chaos it couldn't control. The forest rises before you like a wall, green and shadowed, its canopy whispering with the restless chatter of leaves. 1,000 birds stir in the branches, but your eyes are drawn to something else entirely. The graceful flash of antlers in the gloom, the heavy-footed step of a stag moving silently through underbrush. Your stomach clenches at the thought. Fresh venison. Imagine the rich, dark meat roasting over a fire, dripping fat, filling your hut with smells far finer than turnips or stale bread. For a medieval peasant, that's the dream, isn't it? A single deer could feed your whole family for days. And yet, you dare not move. Your bow stays unstrung, your knife sheathed. Because in this world, to kill that stag is not just a crime. It is treason against the very order of society. You see, one of the oddest medieval customs was this: banning ordinary people from hunting deer. It sounds ridiculous at first. Why outlaw food in a world so often starved? But here's the strange logic. Deer were not considered mere animals. They were living symbols of wealth, of status, of the king's divine right. To kill one without permission was to trespass on power itself. Here's a fact for the record. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, William the Conqueror imposed the brutal forest laws, which reserved vast stretches of woodland exclusively for royal hunting. These laws declared not just the animals but the trees, the soil, the streams, and even the air within those forests as the king's property. Ordinary folk couldn't cut timber, couldn't graze cattle, couldn't gather firewood, and most importantly, couldn't hunt deer. Breaking these laws brought savage punishments, heavy fines, imprisonment, even mutilation. Yes, in some cases, poachers caught killing deer were blinded or had hands cut off. Why so harsh? Because deer were more than meat. They were a king's status symbol. To host a hunting party, leading nobles through woods with packs of hounds, was to showcase power and dominance. It wasn't just about chasing animals. It was about demonstrating control over land and people alike. Now, here's the quirky tidbit. Some records mention that even dogs owned by peasants had to be mutilated to prevent secret hunting. Their claws were sometimes removed or their forepaws maimed so they couldn't chase deer. Imagine being a poor farmer, forced to cripple your own hound because the law feared its hunger. That's how deeply the ban cut into daily life. Of course, people broke the rules anyway. Poaching became both a crime and a kind of folk rebellion. Songs and ballads celebrated the outlaw who dared to snatch a deer from under the king's nose. Think of Robin Hood, stealing not just gold but venison, roasting forbidden meat beneath Sherwood's oaks. The outlaw became a hero precisely because he broke one of the most hated rules of all. Historians still argue about how strictly these bans were enforced. Some say the laws were absolute, crushing peasant life. Others suggest enforcement varied, with lords turning blind eyes if their tenants hunted discreetly. After all, no sheriff could patrol every glade, but the fear of punishment was enough to keep most bows lowered. For society's survival, these rules mattered. On the one hand, they preserved noble privilege. Hunting rights were a badge of status, and by denying them to commoners, the hierarchy of society was constantly reinforced. On the other hand, protecting deer also had ecological effects. If every hungry villager hunted freely, deer populations might vanish. By restricting hunting, the nobility ensured a steady supply of game, for themselves, of course, not for you. In a strange, selfish way, it was a conservation system centuries before the word conservation existed. You picture it now. A nobleman in fine boots, horn to his lips, hounds baying at his heels, charging through the woods in pursuit of the very stag you dared not touch. The peasantry watched from the edges, stomachs growling but powerless. Hunting wasn't just sport, it was theater of class. A lord could prove his valor, his manhood, his wealth, all by slaying an animal you weren't even allowed to look at the wrong way. And yet the ban had strange loopholes. Some communities were granted pannage rights, allowing pigs to forage for acorns in the king's forests. Others could gather deadwood for fires, though not living branches. In certain places, peasants could trap rabbits or birds but never deer. These permissions became tangled webs of local custom, fiercely defended because survival often depended on them. Lose your firewood rights, and winter might kill you faster than hunger. Sometimes, punishments for poaching were theatrical. Offenders were paraded through town with the carcass of the deer hung around their neck, forced to carry the forbidden prize as a symbol of shame. Picture the weight, the stink, the humiliation. It was punishment and warning rolled into one. But the deer ban also shaped culture in subtler ways. Venison became a luxury food, reserved for feasts of kings and nobles. Its scarcity made it symbolic. To eat venison was to taste privilege itself. Recipes for venison stews appear in noble cookbooks, rich with spices imported from afar, dishes peasants could only dream of. Meanwhile, the poor gnawed barley bread and turnip pottage, their diets stripped of variety not by nature alone but by law. And here, where things get complicated, was this really about survival of society or survival of hierarchy? Historians still debate it. Some argue the ban kept ecosystems balanced, preventing overhunting in fragile forests. Others insist it was naked elitism, the rich guarding pleasure at the expense of the poor. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in the muddy middle. Yet think of the survival angle once more. By forcing peasants to live on grain, vegetables, and the occasional chicken, society kept its staple food supply relatively steady. Deer were too rare, too valuable, too tied to status to be thrown into the common pot. Restricting them created scarcity, yes, but scarcity that reinforced order. You wander deeper into the woods now, shadows lengthening, the stag long gone. You feel the weight of the law pressing like branches above your head. To be a medieval peasant was to walk always on this knife edge, between hunger and law, between desire and survival. The deer bounding through the glade was not just food denied, but a reminder of who ruled your life. And yet, in the whispers of leaves and the half-remembered ballads of outlaw heroes, you hear rebellion stirring. People dreamed of breaking that law, of tasting venison forbidden to them, of seizing not just meat but dignity. The deer ban survived for centuries, but so too did the stories of those who defied it. Proof that survival in medieval society wasn't just about obeying rules. Sometimes it was about daring to break them. The air is cold tonight, heavy with mist. You walk slowly along a narrow village path, the sound of church bells tolling in the distance. A funeral is about to begin. A wooden cart creaks forward, its wheels sinking into the mud, and upon it lies a body wrapped tightly in cloth. You draw closer, your breath catching at the sharp mix of incense and the earthy smell of freshly turned soil. In the medieval world, death was never private. It wasn't sealed away in hospitals or mortuaries. It unfolded in the center of community life, and when someone died, the entire village became part of the process. But here's the thing. The rules around death and burial often sound bizarre to modern ears. They weren't just rituals of grief. They were survival strategies, cultural safeguards, and spiritual insurance policies. So tonight you stand among peasants and priests, watching a ceremony shaped by centuries of strange customs. Let's walk through them. One of the deepest medieval fears was that the dead might not stay in their graves. Ghosts, revenants, and walking corpses haunt countless medieval chronicles. These stories weren't just spooky tales told around fires. They shaped real burial practices. In England, for instance, there are records of corpses being dug up, decapitated, or staked through the chest to ensure they didn't rise again. Some skeletons have been found with stones jammed in their mouths, a way of preventing them from biting or calling out. Imagine attending such a grim ritual, watching villagers hold down the body of someone they once knew, hammering iron into its chest to keep it still. These measures weren't cruelty, they were protection. Disease, famine, and war often left people searching for reasons behind tragedy. If misfortune struck after a burial, whispers spread. Perhaps the deceased was wandering, restless, bringing harm from beyond. Better to pin them down. Inside the church, the body lay overnight before burial. Villagers kept vigil, watching over the dead with candles burning at the head and feet. You might think this was simply reverence, but it also had practical roots. Candles discouraged rodents. A watchful crowd made sure no one tampered with the body. Then came the bells. When someone died, the church bell rang in a pattern called the death knell. Its sound carried far across the fields, telling the living that a soul had departed. People believed the ringing frightened away demons, ensuring the dead had a clear path to the afterlife. Some even thought the sound purified the air, protecting the village from infection. A superstition, yes, but in an age without germ theory, any act that reassured people had value. You follow the procession now as it moves toward the churchyard. Where you are laid to rest in medieval Europe mattered enormously. Burial within consecrated ground was essential, because outside of it, salvation was uncertain. Churchyards became crowded, bones piling atop bones, graves dug and redug as space ran short. This led to strange customs. In some towns, bodies were buried only temporarily. Once the flesh decayed, the bones were exhumed and stacked neatly in charnel houses or ossuaries. Imagine stepping into a chapel where walls of skulls stared back at you, eye sockets hollow but strangely serene. These weren't horror decorations, they were spiritual reminders. Memento mori. Remember, you too shall die. And for those denied churchyard burial, criminals, suicides, excommunicated persons, the punishment was not just social but eternal. Their bodies might be buried at crossroads, weighed down with stones, or simply left to decay outside holy bounds. Now look at the graves being dug. Nearly all are aligned east to west. Why? Because the dead were to face east, toward the rising sun and the coming of Christ on Judgment Day. When the trumpet sounded, the faithful would rise facing their Savior. There were exceptions. Priests were sometimes buried facing west, symbolizing their role as shepherds watching over their flock even in death. Warriors might be buried with swords angled across their chests. Some graves show peculiar positions, bodies placed face down as punishment, or as a way to prevent restless spirits from finding their way out. Burial revealed social order as much as life did. Wealthy patrons paid for stone tombs inside churches, their effigies carved in knightly armor or praying robes. The poor were laid outside in the soil, marked with wooden crosses that quickly decayed. But even among the poor, rules mattered. Some guilds and fraternities offered burial funds, ensuring members weren't dumped unceremoniously into pauper pits. To die without community, without prayers, without bells, that was as terrifying as death itself. When plague struck, customs changed drastically. Whole families were buried at once, trenches dug in haste. Priests, overwhelmed, shortened ceremonies. Fear of contagion meant some were buried in lime to hasten decay, their graves marked only by hurried prayers. Yet even then, people clung to rules. In London's plague pits, archaeologists found bodies carefully arranged, not dumped. Even in mass death, the desire for order and dignity persisted. It was survival of the spirit in a time when survival of the body was impossible. Now here's a strange custom, dividing the body. Nobles who died far from home sometimes had their hearts removed, embalmed, and sent separately for burial. Richard the Lionheart's heart rests in Rouen, while his body lies elsewhere. Relics of saints were treated even more dramatically. Bones, hair, even entire corpses were displayed, kissed, and paraded. These weren't ghoulish trophies but channels of holy power. To be buried near a saint's relic was considered a shortcut to heaven. Cemeteries near shrines became prized real estate, with prices reflecting closeness to holy remains. What the dead wore also had rules. Shrouds were often plain linen, symbolizing humility before God. But in earlier medieval centuries, some burials included grave goods, jewelry, weapons, tools. By the High Middle Ages, the Church discouraged this, urging instead the donation of wealth to the poor or to monasteries. Send riches ahead to heaven, priests preached, rather than bury them in the dirt. Yet people found loopholes. Some stitched coins into shrouds or slipped personal charms into coffins. Archaeologists still uncover these hidden rebellions. A pilgrim badge here, a lucky token there, tiny whispers of individuality in a system that demanded sameness. At last the grave is filled. Soil covers cloth, candles gutter in the wind. But the ritual doesn't end there. A medieval funeral was also a feast, a gathering where food and drink bound the living together. To host a proper burial meal was a duty. Failure to do so dishonored the dead. Sometimes these feasts grew wild, wine loosening grief into laughter, dancing, even brawls. The church frowned, of course, but tolerated it, because the point was clear. Death threatened to unravel communities. Rituals of food, fire, and fellowship stitched them back together. You step back now from the churchyard, the mist curling around gravestones. What strikes you is how strange all of this must seem. Staking corpses, burying bones in ossuaries, ringing bells to chase away demons. And yet, each custom had its reason. They protected against disease, even if only symbolically. They reinforced community bonds. They reminded people of salvation and hierarchy. And above all, they made death manageable. For medieval people, survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about dying well, ensuring that when your body entered the earth, your soul had a chance at eternity. Every odd burial rule, every strange graveside ritual, was an attempt to master the terror of mortality. And now, as we leave those churchyards behind and let the mist close gently over the stones, it's time to soften everything down. The bells grow quieter in the distance, no longer tolling for souls but fading into memory, just as the footsteps of that village procession slip away. You've walked through a world of rules and rituals, some of them strange, some of them almost comforting, all of them woven together into the fragile fabric of survival. It's easy to smile at the odd customs of the past, candles at the feet of a corpse, coins sewn into a shroud, bells rung to frighten demons away. But if you look closer, you see what really kept people going. Not just food, not just fire, not just shelter, but the shared sense that no one walked the path of life, or the path of death, alone. In every strange practice there was, hidden beneath it, a kind of care. So let those images soften now. Picture the last candle flickering low, its smoke curling lazily upward until it vanishes into night. Picture the churchyard growing quiet, the earth settling back into place, the air turning cool and still. Everything slows, everything rests, and you can rest too. The fears of plague and restless spirits are centuries away. The heavy bells, the clatter of carts, the whispers of villagers, they've all faded into the gentle hush of the present moment. All that's left for you now is quiet breathing, the weight of your blankets, and the slow drift toward sleep. So close your eyes, let the old stories sink into silence, and carry with you only the calm, steady rhythm of the night. Sweet dreams.